The morning of June 15th, 1944, above the English Channel, Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann stood in the operations room of a Luftwaffe coastal radar station near Calais, watching the green glow of his Würzburg Riese display with growing unease. For 3 years, he had tracked Allied aircraft with what Germany considered its most advanced fire control radar. The 7.4-meter dish outside could detect bombers at 70 kilometers and guide flak batteries with what his training manual called unprecedented accuracy. But the numbers told a different story. The latest intelligence report sat on his desk, marked streng geheim, top secret. It contained a statistic that seemed impossible, yet came from the Luftwaffe's own quartermaster general. On average, German 88-millimeter batteries were now expending 16,000 shells to shoot down a single American bomber. 16,000. Hoffmann had read the number 3 times, certain it was a typographical error. It was not. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Hoffmann did not yet understand, what few in the Wehrmacht understood in the summer of 1944, was that Allied anti-aircraft defenses had undergone a technological revolution that rendered German radar systems obsolete almost overnight. The evidence was everywhere, but the pieces had not yet been assembled into a coherent picture. German pilots returned from missions over Allied positions reporting flak of impossible accuracy. Batteries that seemed to track individual aircraft through clouds, shells that exploded with devastating precision even when the guns had no visual contact with their targets. The Allies, it seemed, had solved problems that German engineers still considered theoretical. The story of how German radar operators and technical staff discovered the true extent of Allied radar superiority is not one of captured equipment or intelligence coups, though those would come later. It is the story of men like Hoffmann, watching their instruments and tallying their shell expenditures, slowly realizing that the technological assumptions upon which the Reich's air defense rested were fundamentally wrong. It is a story about the collision between doctrine and reality, between what German engineering insisted was possible and what Allied bombers proved was true every day in the skies over Europe. To understand what changed, we must first understand what German radar operators believed they possessed in 1944. The Würzburg system, in its various iterations, represented the culmination of German radar development in the early war years. Designed by Telefunken under the direction of Wilhelm Runge, it operated at a wavelength of 50 centimeters, using a parabolic reflector to focus radio pulses and detect returning echoes from aircraft. The original model, small enough to be trailer-mounted, had entered service in May 1940. By 1941, engineers had added conical scanning, a rotating receiver feed that allowed the system to track targets more accurately. In the D model, this modification increased accuracy substantially, though it remained insufficient for blind fire control. The larger Würzburg Riese, or Giant Würzburg, featured a 7.4-meter dish and could achieve a zenith and elevation accuracy of 0.1 to 0.2 degrees. This was considered good enough for direct gun laying, meaning the radar could, in theory, provide targeting data accurate enough to point guns at aircraft without optical confirmation. Over 4,000 Würzburg units of various types were produced during the war, making them the backbone of German flak defenses. But there was a fundamental limitation built into the Würzburg system, one that German engineers understood but had not yet overcome: the 50-centimeter wavelength. This relatively long wavelength limited the system's resolution and accuracy. More critically, it made the radar susceptible to a British countermeasure called window. Strips of aluminum foil, dropped from bombers that created thousands of false echoes, overwhelming the radar's ability to distinguish actual aircraft from chaff. When the RAF first deployed Window in July 1943 during the bombing of Hamburg, German radar operators watched helplessly as their screens filled with false contacts. In a single night, the effectiveness of the Würzburg system plummeted. German engineers scrambled to develop countermeasures and improvements. By early 1944, Telefunken had produced the Marbach, a 10-centimeter radar system with greater immunity to Window. But production remained limited, and only a handful of batteries protecting major industrial centers received the new equipment. The Mannheim and Ansbach systems followed, attempting to combine improved accuracy with mobility, but these too came in insufficient numbers and too late to affect the broader air defense picture. The doctrine surrounding German radar operations reflected both the capabilities and limitations of the technology. During daylight operations, radar served primarily to direct optical fire control toward the target. Once the Flak battery's optical instruments acquired the bomber, the radar stepped back, and the guns were controlled optically through the engagement. At night, radar would indicate the target to searchlight crews, who would illuminate the aircraft for optical tracking and targeting. Even the most advanced Würzburg Ries was not trusted for pure radar-directed fire control except in the most urgent circumstances. This reliance on optical confirmation created a fundamental vulnerability. Clouds, darkness, smoke, or simple distance could prevent optical acquisition, rendering even the most sophisticated radar setup nearly useless for actual gun laying. German Flak batteries compensated by firing predicted box barrages, essentially filling a volume of sky with shrapnel and hoping the target would fly into it. This required enormous ammunition expenditure for minimal results. By June 1944, the statistics reflected this inefficiency. Hans-Georg von Seidel, the Luftwaffe's quartermaster general, had compiled the averages: 16,000 rounds for the 88mm Flak 36 gun, 8,000 for the improved Flak 41, 6,000 rounds for the 105mm Flak 39, and 3,000 for the 128mm Flak 40. These figures represented a massive drain on German industrial capacity. Hundreds of millions of shells were being consumed in a defensive effort that, despite its cost, was becoming increasingly ineffective. Yet even as German Flak effectiveness stagnated, something remarkable was happening on the Allied side. Beginning in early 1944, German pilots and radar operators began noticing a dramatic increase in Allied anti-aircraft effectiveness. At first, these reports seemed anomalous, isolated incidents of unusually accurate fire, lucky hits, statistical flukes. But as the months progressed, a pattern emerged. Allied Flak was becoming exponentially more deadly, and no one in the German command structure could adequately explain why. The first clear demonstration came not over Germany, but over the beaches of Italy. In February 1944, Allied forces established a beachhead at Anzio south of Rome. German air attacks on the confined beachhead met unexpectedly accurate anti-aircraft fire. Luftwaffe bomber pilots reported fire control of impossible precision, guns that seemed to track them through clouds, shells that exploded with deadly accuracy even when the aircraft were maneuvering violently. Multiple crews reported the same phenomenon. They would be flying through overcast, confident that the Allies could not see them, when sudden flak bursts would bracket their aircraft with terrifying accuracy. Something new was operating at Anzio, and it was killing German bombers at a rate no one had predicted. What German intelligence did not yet know was that the Allies had deployed the SCR-584, an automatic tracking microwave radar system that represented a quantum leap in fire control technology. Developed by the MIT Radiation Laboratory in the United States, the system operated at a wavelength of 10 centimeters, 5 times shorter than the Würzburg. This shorter wavelength provided dramatically improved resolution and accuracy, allowing the radar to determine range within 75 feet and angular position within 0.06 degrees. Perhaps more importantly, the system featured true automatic tracking. Once a target was detected and locked, motors mounted in the antenna's base kept the radar pointed at the target without human intervention, adjusting continuously for changes in the aircraft's position, speed, and altitude. The SCR-584 worked in conjunction with the M9 Director, an analog computer developed by Bell Telephone Laboratories. The computer received electrical inputs directly from the radar, range, azimuth, and elevation, and calculated the necessary gun positions to intercept the target, accounting for projectile ballistic characteristics, target velocity, and even wind conditions. The entire system could control 4 90mm M3 guns simultaneously, providing what amounted to genuine blind fire capability. For the first time in the war, anti-aircraft guns could engage targets they could not see and hit them with consistency. From Hoffman's perspective at his coastal station, the implications of this technology remained invisible. He saw his equipment performing as designed, tracking targets when conditions allowed, struggling when the Allies deployed electronic countermeasures. The Würzburg system had not stopped working. It simply could not compete with what the Allies had fielded. It was not a failure of German engineering in the traditional sense. The Würzburg radar worked exactly as intended. The problem was that the Allied technology had advanced beyond anything German doctrine anticipated. By mid-1944, the statistical evidence of Allied technological superiority had become impossible to ignore. In June, German intelligence noted that Flak batteries had downed 200 1/8th Air Force heavy bombers, while Luftwaffe fighters claimed only 80. This represented a dramatic reversal from earlier in the year when fighters had accounted for the majority of bomber losses. More troubling still, the trend was accelerating. In July and August, Flak would account for approximately 2/3 of all American bombers shot down over German-controlled territory. An 8th Air Force operational analysis produced in November 1944 would later note the shift from the American perspective. During the past year, enemy flak defenses have been concentrated, and our bombers faced many more guns. The percentage of bombers lost to or damaged by enemy fighters has declined sharply, while the percentage lost to flak has declined only moderately. As a result, there has been a steady increase in the relative importance of flak, until in June, July, and August 1944, Flak accounted for about 2/3 of the 700 bombers lost and 98% of the 13,000 bombers damaged. For German radar operators and flak crews, this statistical success felt hollow. Yes, they were shooting down more bombers than the increasingly depleted Luftwaffe fighter force, but the cost was astronomical, and the efficiency remained abysmal compared to Allied anti-aircraft defenses. A German battery might fire thousands of rounds to achieve what Allied gunners accomplished with a few dozen shells. The expenditure of ammunition, the wear on gun barrels, the consumption of scarce copper and steel in shell production, all of it pointed to an unsustainable defensive effort. Werner Hoffmann reviewed his logs night after night, searching for patterns that might explain Allied effectiveness. Were they using new tactics? Better coordination between radar stations? Improved shells? He noted everything: engagement ranges, weather conditions, times of day, phases of the moon. But the data refused to resolve into a coherent answer. The Allies were simply shooting more accurately, tracking more effectively, hitting more consistently. The German system, for all its sophistication and careful engineering, could not match this performance. What Hoffmann could not see from his coastal station were the 3 interconnected technologies that had transformed Allied anti-aircraft defense into a genuinely lethal system. The SCR-584 radar provided tracking accuracy that German systems could not match. The M9 director computed firing solutions with a speed and precision impossible for human calculators. And, though this would not become fully apparent until later in 1944, the Americans had developed a third innovation that made their anti-aircraft shells themselves intelligent. The proximity fuse, or VT-fuzed, used a miniature radio transmitter and receiver built into the shell itself. As the projectile approached its target, the radio waves would reflect off the aircraft, and when the return signal reached sufficient strength, the fuse would detonate the shell automatically. No longer did gunners need to calculate time fuses or hope for a direct hit. A near miss became as deadly as a direct strike, as the shell would explode automatically when it passed within killing range of the target. The combination of these three technologies, the SCR-584 radar, the M9 director, and the proximity fuse, created what military historians would later call the first truly effective anti-aircraft system. It was not any single innovation that made the difference, but rather their integration into a coherent whole. The radar provided accurate tracking data. The computer translated that data into gun-laying commands. The proximity fuse ensured that shells exploding near the target would do damage. Together, they transformed anti-aircraft gunnery from a game of probability into a reliable defensive weapon. By the summer of 1944, Allied forces had deployed these systems across the European theater in significant numbers. The Chrysler Corporation had manufactured over 2,000 SCR-584 units by January 1944. By mid-year, hundreds of these systems were operational, protecting invasion beaches, port facilities, and strategic positions across Allied-held territory. Each one represented a technological advantage that German forces could not counter, and in many cases could not even detect. The true extent of Allied radar superiority would reveal itself most dramatically not over German cities, but in response to Germany's own technological gambit, the Vergeltungswaffe I, or V-1 flying bomb. Beginning in June 1944, Germany launched what it hoped would be a campaign of terror against London, deploying hundreds of jet-propelled cruise missiles from sites across the English Channel. Each V-1 carried nearly a ton of high explosives and flew at speeds exceeding 320 knots, fast enough to outrun most propeller-driven interceptors. The German High Command believed these weapons would overwhelm British defenses through sheer speed and numbers. They were catastrophically wrong. The British response to the V-1 threat demonstrated Allied technological integration at its most effective. Anti-aircraft batteries equipped with SCR-584 radars were positioned along the southeastern coast of England, creating a defensive belt through which every V-1 would have to pass before reaching London. The radars tracked the incoming missiles automatically, feeding targeting data to the M9 directors, which calculated interception points for 90mm guns. The shells themselves were equipped with proximity fuses, meaning they would detonate automatically when passing near the target, critical when engaging a small, fast-moving object. The results were spectacular. In the first week of deployment, Allied anti-aircraft batteries destroyed 17% of all V-1s entering the coastal gun belt. This figure rose steadily as gun crews gained experience with the system. By late July, the destruction rate had climbed to 60%. By August 23rd, 74% of V-1s were being shot down before reaching their targets. On one extraordinary day, 82% of incoming missiles were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire alone. The statistics revealed the true measure of the technological gap. At the beginning of the V-1 campaign, British anti-aircraft guns required approximately 2,500 shells to destroy a single flying bomb. By late August, after SCR-584 radars and proximity fuses had been fully integrated into the defensive system, this figure had dropped to approximately 100 shells per kill, a 25-fold improvement in efficiency. On August 28th, the last day Germany launched V-1s before Allied ground forces overran the launching sites, 104 missiles were fired toward England. Anti-aircraft batteries shot down 64 of them. Fighters accounted for 14 more. Only 4 V-1s reached London. German intelligence officers studying the failure of the V-1 campaign struggled to explain what had gone wrong. The missiles were performing as designed. Their speed, range, and warhead capacity all met specifications. Yet they were being destroyed at rates that made the entire campaign militarily pointless. The British, it seemed, had developed a defense system of impossible effectiveness. Some German analysts hypothesized improved fighter tactics. Others suggested that the British had deployed masses of anti-aircraft guns so dense that even inefficient fire could achieve high kill rates through sheer volume. What German intelligence failed to understand was that Allied success did not stem from tactical innovations or numerical superiority, but from a fundamental technological advantage in radar fire control. The British were not firing more shells. They were firing better shells, guided by better radars, detonated by better fuses. The entire system operated at a level of integration and sophistication that German air defense doctrine had not anticipated and could not match. For radar operators like Werner Hoffmann, the V-1 campaign's failure represented another data point in an increasingly disturbing pattern. The Allies seemed capable of defensive feats that should have been impossible with conventional technology. Reports from the Western Front described similar phenomena. Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft encountered flak of devastating accuracy over the Normandy beaches. Pilots reported that Allied anti-aircraft fire could track them through clouds, adjust to evasive maneuvers, and maintain accuracy at ranges where German flak batteries would be firing blindly. By late 1944, the statistical evidence had become overwhelming. A Luftwaffe study noted that while German 88mm batteries required an average of 16,000 rounds to destroy an American heavy bomber, the more powerful 128mm guns achieved kills with only 3,000 rounds. Still an enormous expenditure, but 1/5 the ammunition consumption of the smaller caliber. The implication was clear. Even Germany's most advanced anti-aircraft weapons were operating at efficiencies far below what military effectiveness required. The technological reality behind Allied success would begin to clarify in December 1944, during Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate attempt to split Allied forces and recapture the port of Antwerp, would inadvertently demonstrate the full integration of Allied radar and fire control technology in ways that could no longer be dismissed or misunderstood. On December 16th, German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, catching American units off guard and creating a dangerous salient in Allied lines. The attack included concentrated Luftwaffe support. Hundreds of aircraft committed to supporting the ground offensive despite fuel shortages and pilot inexperience. German planners hoped that bad weather would ground Allied fighters and neutralize Allied air superiority, allowing German ground forces to advance under friendly air cover. What planners had not anticipated was that weather which grounded fighters did nothing to diminish radar-directed anti-aircraft fire. American artillery units, newly equipped with proximity-fused shells for both anti-aircraft and ground support missions, proved devastatingly effective. The shells, which had been restricted to overwater use due to security concerns, were finally authorized for land combat on December 19th, just 3 days into the offensive. The effect on German forces was immediate and catastrophic. American gunners, using SCR-584 radars to track targets through clouds and snow, began engaging German aircraft with accuracy that seemed impossible given the weather conditions. Proximity-fused shells exploded automatically near their targets, shredding aircraft that would have been safe from conventional time-fused ammunition. From December 19th until Allied forces crossed the Rhine into Germany, radar-directed anti-aircraft fire with proximity fuses destroyed more than 1,000 German aircraft. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Ground combat revealed the technology's versatility in even more dramatic fashion. Artillery batteries firing proximity-fused shells calibrated for airburst detonation 30 to 50 feet above ground took a devastating toll on German infantry and armor. The shells exploded above targets on the reverse slopes of hills, in forests, and behind any cover that would have protected troops from conventional artillery. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army during its counterattack toward Bastogne, wrote to the War Department describing the results. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion, which was trying to get across the Sauer River, with a battalion concentration, and killed by actual count 702. For German forces experiencing this fire for the first time, the effect was psychologically devastating. Soldiers who had learned to take cover in defiles, behind buildings, or in tree lines discovered that American artillery could kill them anyway. The shells simply exploded above their positions, showering shrapnel downward where conventional artillery would have been blocked by terrain or obstacles. Some German units attempting to attack the town of Malmedy found American artillery fire so accurate and so deadly that soldiers charged directly into it rather than endure the sustained bombardment, a tactical desperation born of technological helplessness. By early January 1945, German technical intelligence had begun to piece together the nature of Allied advantages. Unexploded shells recovered from battlefields were examined by ordnance experts, who discovered the miniature radio fuse mechanisms inside. The existence of the proximity fuse was no longer a mystery. What remained unclear was the full extent of the radar systems guiding Allied guns. To their targets, German engineers understood that the Allies possessed superior fire control radar. This much was evident from battlefield performance. But the specific capabilities and limitations of systems like the SCR-584 remained uncertain. Captured Allied equipment provided some answers. When American units abandoned radar systems during tactical withdrawals, German technical teams recovered the equipment and transported it to evaluation facilities. Engineers studying the hardware found automatic tracking mechanisms of remarkable sophistication, radar wavelengths shorter than anything in German service, and integration between radar, computer, and guns that represented a level of systems engineering Germany had not achieved. The 10-centimeter wavelength of the SCR-584 provided resolution and accuracy that German 50-centimeter systems could not match. The automatic tracking eliminated human error and reaction time from the engagement sequence. The electrical coupling between radar and gun director meant that targeting data flowed continuously and immediately to the fire control system. Werner Hoffmann, promoted to major and transferred to a technical intelligence unit, was among those who examined captured Allied radar equipment in early 1945. He spent hours studying the SCR-584's antenna assembly, noting the precision of the mechanical components, the sophistication of the conical scanning system, the quality of the electrical connections. Everything spoke to manufacturing capacity and technical capability that Germany could not match, even if German engineers had designed equivalent systems years earlier. But it was not simply the hardware that impressed Hoffmann. It was the integration, the way the radar, computer, and guns formed a single coherent system, each component designed specifically to work with the others. German air defense had evolved piecemeal, with radar systems developed separately from fire control computers, guns designed without full knowledge of the radar's capabilities, and doctrine written to accommodate technological limitations rather than overcome them. The Allied approach had been holistic from the beginning. The SCR-584 was never intended to operate alone. It was one component of an integrated fire control system where every element amplified the effectiveness of every other element. German engineers recognized another critical advantage in Allied manufacturing. The United States had produced approximately 1,700 SCR-584 systems by war's end, plus thousands of proximity fuses produced daily by multiple factories. This industrial capacity allowed the Allies to deploy advanced technology across the entire theater, equipping not just elite units but standard anti-aircraft batteries. Germany, by contrast, had produced a handful of advanced Marbach 10-centimeter radars and a few dozen Mannheim systems, none of which had been manufactured in sufficient quantity to affect the broader defensive picture. By February of 1945, the nature of the technological gap was clear to German technical staff, even if broader recognition remained elusive. The Allies had developed superior radar systems, integrated them with advanced fire control computers and proximity-fused ammunition, manufactured these systems in quantities sufficient to deploy them widely, and created doctrine that maximized their effectiveness. Germany had pursued parallel paths of development. Experimental proximity fuses were found in Rheinmetall facilities after the war, and 10-centimeter radar prototypes existed in various stages of completion, but had never achieved the industrial capacity, systems integration, or doctrinal sophistication to field these technologies effectively. The final, bitter irony came in March 1945, when German forces attempted one last desperate air assault. Operation Bodenplatte on New Year's Day had already demonstrated the futility of Luftwaffe operations against Allied air defenses, but desperation drove continued attacks. During the defense of the Remagen Bridge, the first intact crossing of the Rhine captured by Allied forces, American anti-aircraft batteries equipped with SCR-584 radars and proximity fuses shot down more than half of the German jet aircraft attempting to destroy the bridge. These were Me-262s, the fastest operational aircraft in the world, capable of speeds exceeding 800 kilometers per hour. Yet radar-directed fire with proximity fuses brought them down with a lethality that made even advanced aircraft effectively obsolete against modern air defenses. For German pilots who survived these engagements, the lesson was clear and terrible. Technological superiority could negate tactical skill, operational experience, and even superior aircraft performance. A radar operator with months of training, operating an automatic tracking system integrated with a gun director and proximity-fused ammunition, could engage and destroy targets that would have been nearly invulnerable to conventional anti-aircraft fire. The human element, courage, determination, flying skill, had been rendered secondary to technological advantage. By March 1945, Werner Hoffmann sat in a bunker south of Berlin, surrounded by technical reports that told a story of comprehensive technological defeat. The files contained analyses of captured Allied radar systems, examinations of proximity fuses recovered from unexploded shells, interrogations of Luftwaffe pilots who had faced radar-directed fire, and statistical compilations that quantified the cost of Germany's technological disadvantage. The numbers were stark and undeniable. Allied anti-aircraft systems achieved kill rates 3 to 7 times higher than equivalent German systems. Where German batteries expended 16,000 shells to destroy a bomber, Allied batteries required a few hundred. Where German radar operators struggled to track targets through clouds and electronic countermeasures, Allied systems maintained lock automatically. Where German fire control relied on optical confirmation and human calculation, Allied systems operated electrically, with continuous data flow from radar to computer to guns. The most complete demonstration of Allied technological superiority had come not from captured equipment or intelligence reports, but from battlefield performance data compiled over months of combat. In the defense against V-1 flying bombs, Allied anti-aircraft batteries had improved from 17% effectiveness to over 74% in a matter of weeks, not through tactical innovation or numerical superiority, but through the deployment and refinement of integrated radar fire control systems. Against the Remagen Bridge, American batteries had shot down jet aircraft flying at speeds that should have made them effectively immune to anti-aircraft fire. What Hoffman found most striking was not the superiority of any individual Allied technology, but rather the systematic nature of their advantage. The Americans had not simply built better radars or better shells. They had created an entire technological ecosystem where each component enhanced the others. The SCR-584's 10-centimeter wavelength provided the resolution necessary for precise tracking. The M9 Director's analog computation translated tracking data into gun-laying commands faster and more accurately than human calculators. The proximity fuses ensured that near misses counted as hits. Together, these technologies transformed anti-aircraft gunnery from an art into a science, from probability into consistency. German attempts to match this integration had come too late and with insufficient resources. The Marbach 10-centimeter radar existed, but remained in prototype or limited production. German proximity fuse programs, based on electrostatic rather than radio principles, had been cancelled in 1940, restarted in 1944, and then terminated again as Allied forces overran production facilities. Even if these systems had reached production, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to manufacture them in the quantities necessary to equip every Flak battery across the Reich. The broader implications extended beyond anti-aircraft defense. The technological sophistication demonstrated by Allied radar systems revealed an industrial and scientific capacity that Germany could not match. The United States alone was producing 40,000 proximity fuses per day by late 1944. The MIT Radiation Laboratory had developed the SCR-584 in less than 2 years from initial concept to field deployment. This speed of innovation, coupled with massive manufacturing capacity, meant that Allied technological advantages would compound over time rather than diminish. For the men who had operated German radar systems throughout the war, technicians like Hoffman, who had watched their instruments night after night, tracking bombers and calling targeting data to Flak batteries, the realization carried a particular bitterness. They had done their jobs competently, operated their equipment properly, followed doctrine precisely. The Würzburg radar had performed as designed. The Flak guns had fired accurately when given proper targeting information. The system had worked. It had simply been overwhelmed by Allied technology that worked better. The human cost of this technological gap was measured in tens of thousands of Allied bomber crew casualties, hundreds of thousands of German civilians killed in air raids that German defenses could not stop, and the grinding expenditure of German resources on defensive measures that proved inadequate. By late 1944, over 1 million German personnel were assigned to anti-aircraft duties, manning 9,000 heavy guns, 30,000 light guns, and 15,000 searchlights. This enormous defensive effort, consuming men and material desperately needed elsewhere, had failed to halt the Allied bombing campaign. In November and December 1943, German Flak batteries had averaged 4,000 rounds of heavy ammunition and 6,500 rounds of light ammunition per aircraft shot down. By 1944, Despite improvements in German fire control and tactics, these figures had improved only marginally. The average over the entire war stood at 3,343 rounds of heavy ammunition and 4,940 rounds of light ammunition per aircraft destroyed. Expenditures that Allied defenses achieved with a fraction of the shells. Some Luftwaffe analysts had questioned the wisdom of the enormous anti-aircraft commitment, noting that the shells consumed by flak batteries could have been better used by ground forces against Allied tanks and infantry. Others argued that the defensive effort, however inefficient, was necessary to protect German industry and civilian morale. But by early 1945, these debates had become academic. The bombing campaign had succeeded despite German defenses, and the resources committed to anti-aircraft defense had not prevented industrial collapse. For Werner Hoffmann, the technical reports represented more than statistical analysis. They were evidence of how completely Allied scientific and industrial mobilization had outpaced German efforts. The cavity magnetron, provided to the Americans by the British Tizard mission in September 1940, had enabled the development of microwave radar systems far superior to anything Germany deployed. American industrial capacity had translated prototype systems into mass production with a speed German planners had not anticipated. Allied integration of civilian scientists, military engineers, and industrial
manufacturers had created the organizational framework necessary to develop, test, and deploy complex technologies under wartime conditions. Germany had possessed talented engineers and sophisticated understanding of radar principles. The Würzburg had been a competent system when introduced, and German technical intelligence had identified Allied radar developments relatively quickly. But competent technology, deployed in insufficient quantities, and without the system's integration that maximized its effectiveness, could not compete with superior technology deployed comprehensively and integrated thoroughly. The war had been decided in part by which side could more effectively harness scientific knowledge and industrial capacity to produce operational advantages. By April 1945, as Soviet forces approached Berlin and the war entered its final days, the question of technological superiority had become largely irrelevant. Germany's defensive effort had failed not only because Allied radar was superior, but because the entire industrial and scientific infrastructure supporting Allied air operations had proven insurmountable. The radar gap was symptomatic of a broader disparity in manufacturing capacity, in scientific mobilization, in the ability to translate research into operational systems at scale. The legacy of this technological disparity would extend long beyond the war's end. The SCR-584 would remain in service with NATO forces well into the 1950s, its basic design principles informing the development of later air defense systems. The proximity fuse would evolve into increasingly sophisticated variants, eventually enabling guided missiles and precision munitions. The integration of radar, computers, and weapons systems pioneered by the SCR-584 and M9 Director would become the standard approach to fire control, establishing principles that continue to guide air defense development today. For the German radar operators and technical staff who had gradually discovered the extent of Allied superiority through combat experience and captured equipment analysis, the recognition came too late to affect the war's outcome. They had operated within a system that understood radar's importance, but could not match Allied capacity to develop, produce, and deploy superior systems at scale. The technological gap was not a failure of German science or engineering. It was a reflection of industrial and organizational capabilities that Allied nations, particularly the United States, possessed in abundance, and Germany could not replicate under wartime conditions. The story of German realization of Allied radar superiority is ultimately a story about the nature of technological competition in modern warfare. Individual innovations matter less than systematic advantages. Prototype development means nothing without the industrial capacity for mass production. Sophisticated engineering cannot overcome deficiencies in resources, manufacturing infrastructure, and scientific mobilization. The radar gap was real, significant, and ultimately insurmountable, not because German engineers failed to understand the principles involved, but because the gap reflected deeper disparities in industrial capacity and organizational effectiveness that no amount of technical brilliance could overcome. Werner Hoffmann would survive the war, eventually working in the reconstruction of German industry. He never operated a radar station again, but in quiet moments he would remember standing in the green glow of the Würzburg display, watching the echoes of Allied bombers, and knowing, even then, though he could not yet articulate why, that the numbers told a story of technological disadvantage so profound that no amount of courage or determination could overcome it. The Allies had not simply built better radars. They had created an entire system of radar-directed fire control that represented a fundamental leap in capability, and they had deployed it in quantities sufficient to make that technological advantage operationally decisive. The war would end with Allied victory, delivered in part by strategic bombing that German air defenses, despite heroic efforts and enormous expenditure, had ultimately failed to stop. And at the heart of that failure, visible in the statistics and performance data that men like Hoffmann compiled and analyzed, was a simple technological truth. In the contest of radar and fire control systems, Allied superiority had been comprehensive, systematic, and ultimately insurmountable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.